The plane shook, the sudden turbulence jolting the passengers awake. It was a mild bump at first, almost unnoticed. But then the aircraft started to sway, the lights flickering briefly. The seatbelt sign blinked on with a sudden urgency, but no one could see what was happening outside. They didn't know, and it didn't matter at that moment. Not yet. This was supposed to be an ordinary flight, an evening trip to a destination everyone was too busy to care about. But the moment the plane took off from the ground, there was a strange sense that something was off. Something was wrong. Sarah Mitchell, a 35-year-old writer, stared out of the window, her thoughts as scattered as the clouds beneath her. She was an ordinary woman with an extraordinary dream, to write the perfect story, one that would touch the hearts of millions. But her life hadn't been as she imagined. A failed marriage, a career that never took off, and a quiet loneliness had left Sarah seeking solace in her books. As a child, she had always found comfort in escaping into stories. Now, her own life seemed to be nothing more than a story of missed chances and lost dreams. Yet, here she was, aboard Flight 459, on her way to a conference in a city she couldn't even remember. Her face, tired from lack of sleep, barely hid the restlessness within. She gazed at the blank page on her notebook, the cursor blinking mockingly. The seat beside her was empty, as it had been for most of the flight. The solitude offered her peace, but it also allowed her thoughts to spiral. She sighed and clicked the pen in her hand. "Are you all right?" The voice came from the man sitting across the aisle. He was a tall figure, slightly older than her, with dark hair and a stern face that softened when he spoke. His name was Richard, a businessman from London. He had been polite but distant ever since boarding the flight. Sarah nodded, giving him a small smile. "Just tired, I guess." "It's been a long day," she replied, her voice trailing off. She didn't want to explain the rest, how her life felt like it was stuck on autopilot, flying toward nowhere. Richard studied her for a moment, his eyes sharp and assessing. "I get that. A lot of people are running away from something," he said cryptically, leaning back in his seat. A tense silence hung between them, and Sarah looked away. What did he mean? Was he implying something about her? She didn't want to think about it, so instead, she turned her attention back to the window, watching the lights of the city grow smaller in the distance. The flight had taken off from an airport that Sarah barely recognized, but now, as the hours passed, the landscape below had begun to change in strange ways. The sky, which had been a calm, dusky blue earlier, had become an unsettling shade of purple. The clouds were thicker, swirling in odd patterns. The city lights had vanished long ago, replaced by a vast expanse of empty space. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Why is it so dark?" Sarah wondered aloud, glancing at Richard. The cabin lights flickered once more, and the plane rumbled ominously. "I don't know," he muttered, staring out of his own window. "It feels like we've been flying too long." Sarah squinted at the cabin's clock. It was nearly 10:30 p.m. But the flight had been scheduled to take just a few hours. Why did it feel like they were flying forever? The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the turbulence. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. We will be landing shortly." Landing? Sarah's heart skipped a beat. But where? They hadn't passed any signs of an airport. No lights, no land below. It felt as if they were moving through an endless void. The plane lurched again, this time more violently. A collective gasp filled the cabin, and passengers clutched their armrests. The flight attendants hurried down the aisles, their faces pale with concern. Sarah's heart raced as her stomach tightened. She had flown enough times to recognize when something was wrong, and this was beyond the usual turbulence. Suddenly, the plane's nose dipped downward. The engines roared, the sound deafening, as though they were plummeting. Sarah gasped and gripped the seat in front of her. Other passengers were screaming. One woman was praying aloud, her voice trembling. "Please! Not like this. Please, God, she cried. The plane jerked again, and then, as if the world had decided to press pause, everything stopped. The plane was still. No noise, no motion. It hung in the air, suspended in a vast, still silence. The lights flickered once, twice, and then stayed off. Sarah's hands shook, her pulse pounding in her ears. Was this it? Was this the end? The intercom buzzed again. Ladies and gentlemen, we have encountered an unexpected situation. Please remain calm. The captain's voice was strained, almost unrecognizable. What did he mean? Sarah thought, her breath shallow. She glanced around, meeting the eyes of the other passengers. Fear was evident on every face, yet no one seemed to know what was going on. Suddenly, the plane jerked forward with a lurch. The sense of motion returned, but it was a strange kind of movement. The sound of the engines, which had been silent, roared back to life, but there was something off about it. The vibration beneath Sarah's feet felt different. She could feel the shift in the air, an electric charge that crackled through her body. It was as if the entire world was rearranging itself. Where are we going? Sarah thought in a daze. Where is this place? The plane descended slowly, as if finding a landing strip that didn't exist. Below them was a strange, unfamiliar landscape. A sprawling city with towering buildings, but they looked odd, disconnected, as though they had been copied and pasted from different places. The streets were eerily quiet, empty of people, and the sky above was streaked with swirling colors that defied logic. The plane touched down with a sudden, jarring force. The wheels skidded, scraping against something solid yet unfamiliar. It was as if they had arrived in a world that didn't belong to the one they had come from. The doors opened, and a cold gust of air rushed into the cabin. The passengers looked out, and the realization hit them all at once: this wasn't their world anymore. They had traveled to a parallel world. And it wasn't just the flight that had changed. They had too. The cabin door opened with a loud hiss, releasing a blast of cold air. The passengers hesitated, peering out into the unfamiliar world. Sarah felt a strange chill crawl down her spine. This was not the world they had left behind. This place, this strange, twisted version of a city, was beyond anything she had imagined. The buildings loomed high, their edges blurred, as though they were a distorted reflection in a cracked mirror. The sky overhead was a sickly purple, swirling with ominous clouds. There were no stars, no lights from the city, just the eerie glow of an unfamiliar horizon. Sarah felt her chest tighten. She wanted to stay on the plane, where it felt somewhat safe, even if it was just a false sense of security. But the sound of murmurs and gasps from the other passengers grew louder, pulling her from her thoughts. A few people were already standing up, grabbing their bags, their faces pale with confusion and fear. Where are we? A voice from behind her trembled, and Sarah turned to find an older woman with wide, frightened eyes. I don't know, Sarah whispered, but the words felt hollow. What was there to know? There were no answers, no explanations. Richard stood up, his face set in a tense frown. We need to stay calm, he said, but even his voice shook slightly. He looked around at the other passengers, his brow furrowed in uncertainty. This can't be real. Something's wrong, but panicking won't help. Sarah caught his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something deep, almost desperate. She saw that he, too, was searching for a reason, a way to explain what was happening. A man in a business suit stumbled past them, his eyes wide with disbelief. We're stuck here. This place isn't real. This isn't Earth. Stay calm. Richard shouted after him, but the man was already sprinting down the aisle toward the open door. No one stopped him. The door stood wide open, the chill seeping into the cabin like a creeping fog. Wait! Sarah heard herself shout, but the words seemed too late. The man had already stepped outside, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence of the strange world beyond. Is anyone going after him? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. She didn't know what to do. Should they follow? Stay inside? There were no answers, only the weight of uncertainty pressing in on them from all sides. I'll go, Richard said, his voice calm despite the storm of fear in his eyes. He glanced at Sarah. Stay here, and stay close. We don't know what's out there. I'm not staying here, Sarah retorted, surprising herself with the fierceness in her voice. She felt her heart race, the adrenaline pushing her forward. If they were stranded here, they needed to find out where they were. They needed to understand what had happened. Richard studied her for a long moment, as if measuring her resolve. Fine, he said, nodding. But stay close. We don't know what we're dealing with. Together, they stepped out of the plane, the metal door creaking shut behind them with a finality that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. The air was thin and bitterly cold, and she hugged her arms tightly around her body for warmth. The ground beneath her feet was soft, almost marshy, and the smell of damp earth lingered in the air. The city around them seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural energy, the tall buildings casting long shadows across the ground. The other passengers slowly followed them, some hesitantly, others driven by a deep sense of fear. No one spoke at first, each person too absorbed in their own shock and confusion. What is this place? Someone whispered, but no one had an answer. Richard began walking cautiously toward the city, his steps slow and deliberate. Sarah followed, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Everything looked wrong. The buildings weren't like anything she had ever seen before. They were tall, jagged, and seemed to distort as if they had been thrown together in haste, or perhaps, Sarah thought with a chill, a broken version of something familiar. There were no people, no sounds, except the distant hum of something that might have been electricity running through the streets. Is anyone else here? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Richard said, shaking his head. It's just us. But we're not alone. Suddenly, they heard a distant sound, like a low, mechanical hum. It grew louder, and Sarah's heart began to race again. What was that? Was it a machine? Or something else? The hum grew closer, and they saw a figure in the distance. It was hard to make out, the shadow of a person moving quickly through the mist. The silhouette was tall, too tall to be human. A sense of dread crawled up Sarah's spine. Richard, what is that? She asked, her voice thick with fear. I don't know, he replied, his jaw tight. Stay behind me. They stood frozen as the figure drew closer, its form becoming clearer with each passing second. When it finally emerged from the shadows, it was a strange, imposing creature, tall, with elongated limbs and an angular face, its skin pale and smooth. It didn't look entirely human, though its features were disturbingly similar. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, and its expression was blank, as though it wasn't even aware of them. The creature stopped a few feet away from them, its eyes scanning them with an unsettling calm. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Was it going to attack? What did it want? The creature spoke, its voice a low, mechanical rasp. You are not from here. It was the first sign of communication they had received since arriving. Sarah's stomach dropped, and her hands began to shake. What did that mean? Were they being hunted? We don't know where we are, Richard said, his voice wavering slightly. We're just trying to understand. Please, we mean no harm. The creature's head tilted slightly, and for a moment, it just stood there, watching them. Then, without warning, it turned and began to walk away, its long strides carrying it back toward the city. Wait! Sarah called out, a sudden impulse driving her forward. She ran to catch up to it, but Richard grabbed her arm, pulling her back. Don't follow it, he urged, his grip firm. We don't know what it is. But it spoke to us. It didn't attack us. Maybe it can help, Sarah insisted, her mind racing. Richard paused, his gaze locked on the creature. After a long moment, he sighed. Maybe you're right. But we need to be careful. Whatever this is, it's not normal. Together, they stood in the middle of this strange, unfamiliar world, unsure of where to go or who to trust. One thing was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. They had come here by accident, but now they had to survive. And to do that, they would need answers. Sarah and Richard followed the strange figure through the mist, their steps growing more hesitant with every passing moment. The city around them seemed to stretch endlessly, its jagged structures looming in the distance, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with the flickering light. The ground beneath their feet felt uneven, and the air was thick, heavy with an eerie stillness that made every sound seem amplified. "What do you think it was?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it some kind of alien?" Richard didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the creature ahead of them, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't know," he muttered. "But something about it doesn't feel right. It's just too perfect, you know? Like it's not human at all." Sarah's stomach churned. She had felt it too, the cold, unnatural presence of the creature. It was as though they had stepped into a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. It was as if they were surrounded by shadows of something that once was but had long since been replaced by something else. They continued walking, the sound of their footsteps the only noise in the oppressive silence. Suddenly, the creature halted and turned toward them, its elongated face expressionless. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "You are far from home," it said in its strange, rasping voice. "Do not wander too far." Richard stepped forward, his voice steady despite the unease he clearly felt. "We don't know how we got here. We just arrived." The creature regarded them for a moment, and then, to their surprise, it spoke again, this time in a tone that was almost gentle. "There are others here. Others who do not welcome strangers." Before they could respond, the creature turned away, disappearing into the shadows of the city. Sarah and Richard exchanged a look, and then, without another word, they followed it. As they moved deeper into the city, the tension mounted. The air grew colder, and the sky above them seemed to darken, the swirling clouds pressing in closer. The city itself felt more and more alien, the streets winding in impossible directions, the buildings rising at odd angles, as if gravity itself had no hold here. Sarah's heart raced, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "I don't like this," Richard muttered, his eyes darting around. "It feels like we're walking into a trap." Sarah didn't argue. She felt the same way. But what other choice did they have? They had to keep moving. They had to find out where they were and how they could get back. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound from one of the alleyways ahead. Both Sarah and Richard froze, their bodies tense. From the shadows emerged another figure, tall, thin, and draped in tattered cloth. The figure's face was obscured by a hood, but the way it moved was unsettling. Its gait was jerky, like it was unsure of its own steps. The figure stopped when it saw them, its head tilting as it observed them with strange, glowing eyes. "You should not be here," the figure said in a low, guttural voice. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Was it a threat? She couldn't tell. The creature's voice was harsh, but there was something desperate in it too, as if it didn't want them here either. "We're just trying to figure out what's happening," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. "We don't know where we are or how we got here." The figure didn't respond right away. Instead, it took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. "You will not find answers here. Only danger," it said, its voice trembling slightly. "They are coming." "Who's coming?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound confident. "The ones who live in the shadows," the figure whispered, its voice barely audible. "They hunt those who don't belong." Richard stepped forward, his expression hardening. "We don't have time for cryptic warnings. Tell us what's going on." The figure hesitated, as if considering its options. "The city is shifting. The walls are closing in. They've awoken, and they know you are here. You must leave now, or they will find you." Before either of them could react, the figure turned and fled back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had come. Great, Sarah muttered, frustration bubbling in her chest. Now what? Richard didn't answer. Instead, he began to move forward again, his eyes scanning the area. Sarah followed, her mind racing. The strange figure's warning echoed in her thoughts. The ones who live in the shadows. Who were they? What did they want? And how did the figure know they weren't from here? Suddenly, a loud, screeching noise split the air. Sarah flinched, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to see a dark figure darting from behind a building, its shape shifting unnaturally as it moved. It was fast, too fast, and its eyes gleamed with an unsettling hunger. Richard, she cried, grabbing his arm. Run! But Richard had already taken off, his long legs carrying him swiftly across the uneven ground. Sarah followed, her feet pounding against the strange terrain as the creature pursued them. Its screeches echoed in the air, a sound that grated on her nerves and sent a chill down her spine. They rounded a corner, and suddenly the creature stopped. Sarah skidded to a halt beside Richard, who was breathing heavily, his face pale. What the hell was that? Sarah gasped, her mind racing. Richard's eyes were wide with shock. I don't know. But I think it's one of the ones who live in the shadows. The ones the figure warned us about. We can't stay here. We have to get out of the city. Sarah's voice was firm, the fear in her chest slowly turning into determination. I agree, Richard said, his gaze sharp. But we need help. We're not going to survive this on our own. As if on cue, a voice called out from the shadows. You won't survive at all unless you join us. Sarah and Richard turned in unison to find another figure emerging from the darkness. It was a young woman, her features sharp and fierce, her eyes scanning them with a wary intensity. She was dressed in dark, torn clothing, and she held a knife in one hand, its blade glinting in the dim light. We need to stick together, the woman said. If you want to live, follow me. Without waiting for a response, she turned and began to walk away, her movements fluid and confident. Richard exchanged a look with Sarah before nodding. We have no choice, he muttered. Together, they followed the woman into the depths of the city, uncertainty swirling in their minds as the danger they faced grew ever more real. The stakes were higher now. They weren't just trying to survive, they were fighting to find out the truth of where they were, and how they could escape before the city swallowed them whole. The city had become a labyrinth. Every street felt like a new, twisted path that led them deeper into the unknown. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and the tension that had built up over the past hours now seemed unbearable. The air was thick with dread, and the feeling of being hunted, the oppressive, silent presence of the shadows, had become almost tangible. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on them. They had followed the mysterious woman, whose name they had learned was Lila, deeper into the heart of the city. She led them through winding alleys, her eyes constantly flicking over her shoulder, as though expecting something to emerge from the darkness at any moment. Richard kept close to Sarah, his expression tight with concern. Every now and then, they would hear distant sounds, screeches, footsteps, and whispers, carrying through the empty streets. Something was moving out there, something that watched them with an intelligence far beyond their understanding. Lila finally stopped in front of a rusted, iron door hidden between two crumbling buildings. She motioned for them to stop, her voice low. This is it. The last safe place, she said, her words clipped with urgency. If they find us here, it's over. Richard exchanged a glance with Sarah before nodding. What exactly is it? What are we walking into? Lila didn't answer immediately. She grabbed the door handle, wincing as it squeaked. You'll see. Just trust me. Sarah felt the weight of the moment, she could sense that this would be their final chance to figure out what was really happening. They had to make a decision now. They couldn't go back. There were no second chances. They had no idea what lay beyond that door, but something told her that stepping through it was the only way forward. With a deep breath, Sarah followed Lila inside, Richard at her side. They entered a dimly lit room, its walls lined with strange symbols and shifting shadows. The air was thick with the scent of something unfamiliar, and the room seemed to pulse with energy. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate stone pedestal, a swirling orb resting atop it. The orb emitted a soft glow, shifting from blue to purple, its light casting eerie reflections on the walls. Lila walked toward it, her face unreadable. She reached out and placed her hand on the orb. "This is it," Lila said quietly. "The key to everything." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean? What is this thing?" Lila turned to them, her eyes cold, yet tinged with something darker. "This is the heart of the city. The source of its power. And it's the reason you're here." Richard stepped forward, his voice rising with frustration. "The reason we're here? What does that even mean?" Lila's gaze hardened. "You're not just here by accident. You were brought here for a purpose. The city needs you. The others need you." Before Sarah could respond, the distant screech of something inhuman echoed through the streets. It was closer this time. Louder. More urgent. "They're coming!" Lila hissed, her voice sharp with panic. "You don't understand. Once they find you." "Who are they?" Sarah demanded, stepping closer. "What do they want?" Lila's expression faltered, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw fear flicker across her face. "They're not human, and they're not from here either. They were once like you, people who came to the city, looking for answers. But they failed. They became something else." Suddenly, the room trembled as the screeching grew louder. A gust of wind whipped through the open door, scattering papers and dust. The stone pedestal began to glow brighter, the orb pulsing in sync with the distant sound of claws scraping against the ground. "They're here," Lila whispered. "And they're not going to let you leave. You have to stop them." "What do we do?" Richard asked, panic creeping into his voice. Lila turned to Sarah and Richard, her eyes wide with desperation. "You have to destroy the orb. If you don't, they will consume everything. The city, this world, it will all be theirs. And you'll be like them." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Destroy the orb? But it was the source of all the city's power, wasn't it? It seemed impossible. She looked at Richard, her mind racing. They had come so far, and now, they were expected to destroy everything they had learned about. But the alternative, what was the alternative? "Sarah, you have to make a choice," Richard said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. "If we don't destroy it, we're as good as dead. All of us. We might be the only ones who can stop this." Her mind spun. This orb, was it really the key to everything? Could she really destroy it, even if it meant erasing everything they had learned, everything they had fought for? She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself, but the sounds of the creatures outside were growing louder. The shadows were closing in. She could feel them, pressing against the walls, waiting to burst through. There was no time left. With one final breath, Sarah nodded. "We have no choice." She rushed toward the pedestal, Richard beside her, his face grim with determination. The moment she touched the orb, a shockwave of energy rippled through the room, sending them both stumbling backward. The glow of the orb intensified, its light becoming almost blinding. The city trembled around them, the walls cracking and groaning under the pressure. Then, from the depths of the shadows, the creatures appeared. They were monstrous, twisted forms with elongated limbs, sharp claws, and faces that seemed to be a grotesque mix of human and animal. Their eyes gleamed with hunger, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes being controlled by some unseen force. Lila screamed. "Hurry! You have to!" But it was too late. The creatures surged forward, their screeches deafening as they lunged towards Sarah and Richard. Desperation fueled Sarah's every movement. She reached for the orb again, her fingers brushing its surface, and suddenly, the world seemed to snap. A blast of energy erupted from the orb, sending the creatures tumbling backward. The walls of the room shattered, and the ground cracked open beneath them. The creatures hissed, but their bodies disintegrated, dissolving into nothingness. But the city was collapsing around them. The ground shook violently as cracks spread like veins, reaching out to swallow everything in sight. "Go!" Lila screamed. "Get out now!" With the city crumbling around them, Sarah and Richard bolted for the door. The world was shaking violently, the very foundation of the city breaking apart. The distant screams of the creatures echoed as they disappeared into the void. They made it outside, breathless and disoriented. But the sky was no longer purple. The air was still, and the horizon was once again clear. The world they had entered, the twisted, dark world, was gone. Sarah stood there for a long moment, taking in the scene around her. It was over. The creatures were gone. The city was no more. She turned to Richard. "We did it." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew one thing for certain: their journey wasn't over. The real world still lay ahead. And whatever challenges lay beyond, they would face them together. The aftermath of the battle was silent, almost eerily so. The world around Sarah and Richard was still, as though the very air itself was catching its breath. The city, once a chaotic, writhing mass of shifting shadows, was now a ruin. The ground beneath them was cracked, and the sky, once suffused with strange purple light, was now a muted gray, clear but unsettled. No more grotesque creatures lurked in the corners, no more distant screeches filled the air. It was as if everything had simply stopped. Sarah stood still for a long moment, her chest heaving, eyes scanning the landscape. Her mind struggled to process what had just happened. The orb was gone. The city was gone. They had won, but what had they really won? Was it just the end of a nightmare, or had they destroyed something vital? Beside her, Richard seemed equally lost in thought. He was still breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly wearing off, leaving him drained. His eyes were wide, flicking nervously to the horizon as if expecting something to burst out from the ruins at any second. But nothing came. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. She hadn't realized how much she needed to say those words until they were out. It was a fragile victory, one that felt incomplete, but it was still theirs. They had fought against impossible odds, and they had survived. Richard nodded slowly, wiping a hand across his face. "Yeah, but it doesn't feel like a win, does it?" His voice cracked, betraying the exhaustion he felt. "What happens now? Is it really over?" Sarah turned to him, her heart aching. She understood. They both knew that the fight might be over, but the scars of what they'd experienced would remain. The battle had been more than physical, it had been a battle for their sanity, their lives, their very understanding of reality. Lila, still standing by the now-destroyed pedestal, was the first to break the silence. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but there was a look in her eyes, relief, perhaps, or maybe just resignation. She had led them to the heart of the city and watched the destruction unfold, but now, she seemed almost empty. "You've done it," Lila said softly, her voice quiet and distant. "You've destroyed it. The city won't be a threat anymore." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. The weight of what they had just done was beginning to sink in, and a sense of unease gnawed at her. "But what happens to us now?" she asked. "We've done what we came here to do, but is there a way back?" Lila's lips tightened. "There's no going back," she said, almost too casually. "Not to the world you once knew." Richard's eyes widened, his face pale. "What do you mean? Are you saying we're stuck here?" Sarah looked between Richard and Lila, her heart sinking. She had known it wouldn't be that simple, but hearing it said aloud still sent a chill down her spine. Lila shook her head. "No. You're not stuck. But what you've done," she paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "The barrier between worlds has been weakened. The city was a gateway, a portal between realities. By destroying the heart, you've broken that connection. The way back might be gone forever. For a moment, there was only silence. The implications of Lila's words hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on them all. Sarah's mind raced. Could it really be true? Had they not just destroyed a nightmare but severed the only thread that connected them to the world they had left behind? Richard clenched his fists, clearly struggling to accept the truth. So, we're just supposed to live here now? His voice cracked with frustration. What the hell does that even mean? Lila met his gaze, unflinching. It means you have a chance to rebuild. You've broken the cycle. The city won't trap anyone again. But the world, it's changed. It's waiting for you to shape it. What you do next will determine everything. Sarah bit her lip, feeling the weight of the decision before her. They had fought, they had survived, but what now? She looked at Richard, at Lila, at the ruins of the city. There was so much left to understand. Could they really rebuild something new from all this destruction? Finally, after a long pause, Richard let out a breath, his shoulders sagging with the weight of what they had lost and gained. I don't know what's next, he said, his voice raw. But I'm not giving up. Not after everything we've been through. We'll figure it out. Together. Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions, grief, hope, uncertainty. But she knew one thing for certain, Richard was right. They had to move forward. They had no choice but to try to make sense of the world they found themselves in. Lila stepped forward, her eyes scanning the horizon. You won't be alone, she said quietly. I've been here a long time, longer than I should have been. I've seen what this world can do to people. But I believe in you too. You have what it takes to survive. For a long moment, the three of them stood together in the ruins, the weight of their shared experience binding them. Sarah could feel the bond between them strengthening, born of the hardships they had endured and the trials they had faced together. There was something unspoken in the air, something that told her that this was not the end of their story, but the beginning. Whatever comes next, Sarah said, her voice firm, we'll face it together. I promise. The quiet that followed was a soft acknowledgement of the truth. There was no going back to the life they had once known, but there was still hope. Hope that, together, they could build something new in this strange, fractured world. The ruins around them might have been all that was left of the city, but the future was still unwritten. Richard offered a small, weary smile. Yeah, together. Lila looked between them, her expression softening. I think you'll do just fine. With that, the three of them turned, walking toward the broken horizon where the remnants of the city met the vast unknown. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since they had arrived, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. They had survived. And now, it was up to them to create a new beginning. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the ruins as they took their first steps into the future. The past was behind them, and ahead lay an uncharted world, one they would face together, stronger and more united than ever before. In the days that followed the destruction of the city, Sarah, Richard, and Lila set to work rebuilding what they could. The ruins were silent now, but the world around them still hummed with a strange energy. It was a place caught between endings and beginnings, a place where everything had changed but nothing could be erased. The three of them spent their time clearing debris, gathering what little remained of the city's resources, and attempting to make sense of their new reality. Despite the uncertainty that hung over them, there was something undeniably hopeful in the air, a quiet belief that they could carve a new future out of this strange, fractured world. Sarah found herself standing in front of what had once been a towering structure in the city, its broken pieces scattered across the ground. The destruction was immense, but amidst it all, Sarah could sense the possibility of something new emerging. She ran a hand through her hair, taking a deep breath. The weight of everything that had happened, the battles, the losses, the choices they had made, was heavy on her heart. But there was a sense of peace now, a realization that they had done what they could. Is it enough? she whispered to herself, her voice quiet as she gazed at the remnants of the city. Would the world they had destroyed ever be truly rebuilt? Would they ever be able to find their way home, or had they burned that bridge forever? Richard, as though reading her thoughts, approached her from behind. His footsteps were light, but his presence was unmistakable. He was carrying a bundle of tools, a reminder that there was still work to be done. "We've done the best we could," Richard said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet weight. "We can't undo what happened, but we can build something new." He dropped the tools beside her and looked up at the broken skyline. His eyes were tired, but there was a determination there that hadn't been present when they first arrived in this place. "The city is gone, but we're still here. And we're not giving up. Not now, not ever." Sarah nodded slowly, feeling the warmth of his words sink into her. The weight on her chest didn't disappear, but it became lighter, more bearable. Together, they had fought, and together they had survived. Now, the work was no longer just about survival, it was about building something meaningful. "We're not alone anymore," Sarah said softly, more to herself than to Richard. "We've got each other. And that's enough." Richard's lips twitched into a small smile. "It's more than enough." They stood in silence for a moment, their gaze fixed on the horizon where the ruined city met the vast, empty landscape beyond. It was a strange, unfamiliar sight, one that still felt unreal, but there was no denying that they had been through something extraordinary together. And somehow, that made the world feel less frightening. Lila joined them soon after, her face drawn but determined. She had been moving quietly in the background, always watching, always thinking. But now, as she approached Sarah and Richard, there was a sense of calm about her, an understanding that they were all in this together. "We've come a long way," Lila said, her voice soft but firm. "And there's still a long road ahead. But I believe in what you're doing. I believe in you." The three of them stood together in the ruins, the weight of the past behind them, and the future uncertain but full of possibility. It was a moment of stillness, the calm before the storm, but it wasn't a moment of defeat. They had fought for this moment, and they were determined to make it count. As the days passed, they began to make plans. There was no map for what they were doing, no guide to help them navigate the unknown terrain they now inhabited. But they had each other, and that was enough. They didn't need to know everything, what mattered was that they moved forward, step by step. The days blended together, and slowly, their new life began to take shape. They rebuilt small structures, planting the seeds of a new community. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the enormity of what they had lost threatened to overwhelm them. But in those moments, they turned to each other. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and that was something worth fighting for. Richard, ever the pragmatist, focused on building shelters, gathering resources, and ensuring that they had everything they needed to survive. His hands were calloused from the work, but his eyes were steady. Sarah, on the other hand, found herself turning inward, thinking about the past and what it meant for their future. She spent her days exploring the land, mapping the new world they were creating, and pondering the bigger questions. Was there a way back? Was there a way forward? She wasn't sure yet, but she would keep looking. Lila, too, became an integral part of their growing community. Her quiet strength and deep knowledge of the land made her an invaluable ally. In the quiet moments, Sarah often found herself sitting with Lila, talking about the past, the present, and what might come next. Together, they formed a bond that was stronger than anything Sarah had experienced before. They were no longer strangers, but sisters of circumstance, united by the shared experience of survival. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, Sarah stood at the edge of their small camp, her thoughts heavy with everything that had transpired. It was a moment of reflection, a moment to think about what they had accomplished and where they were going. She could see the shapes of the others in the distance, working by the fading light. They were making progress, and despite everything, there was hope. She didn't know if they would ever return to their old world. The city, the portal, the strange creatures, they were all distant memories now, fading with each passing day. But one thing was certain, they had found a way to move forward. They had made it through the darkest days, and now they were stepping into the light, together. As Richard joined her at the edge of the camp, he placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a comforting squeeze. "It's not perfect," he said quietly, "but it's ours." Sarah smiled, her heart full. "Yes. It is." She turned to face him, her eyes shining with gratitude and something else, something more than hope. "We've come a long way, and we'll keep going." And with that, they walked back into the heart of their new home, ready to face whatever came next, together. The world they had lost might never return, but in its place, they were building something better, something they could call their own. The journey had been long, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but they had learned one important lesson: no matter what came their way, they would face it, side by side. And that, in the end, was all they needed.